Speedy. My Lady, we act for the National Disabled People's Organisations, or DPO, Disability Rights UK and Disability Action Northern Ireland. The DPO see the economics of the pandemic as fashioned by four matters: money, means, exclusion, and design. First, money. Your Ladyship will hear evidence that billions of pounds were expended by the government in economic response to the pandemic through unprecedented measures for unprecedented times. The DPO ask, in all seriousness and not at all flippantly, where did this money go? And what did the money do? Who received and benefited from this unprecedented economic support? And who missed out by design? The expenditure shows that where there is a will, the state is able to implement extraordinary economic adjustments through newly designed interventions directed at providing, as the Chancellor of the Exchequer put it when he spoke to the nation on the 20th of March 2020, a significantly strengthened safety net. The overall balance of the expenditure is also revealing about the choices that are made about what constitutes a significantly strengthened safety net and what is deserving of economic intervention. But did disabled people receive support and benefit from unprecedented measures? Was the safety net strengthened significantly for them? Did key economic interventions even include them? Did they actively exclude them? And where has this left them in anticipation of the next pandemic? Second, means. The inquiry published some critical findings last week, not only about the qualities of individual decision makers and systems of government, but of deeper matters relevant to the way we live together in times of peace and times of crisis. Your Ladyship concluded that the pandemic touched the lives of everyone, but its impact was not shared equally. And of the people who suffered from the social and economic and cultural consequences of the steps taken to combat the pandemic, the people who suffered the most were those who were socially and economically disadvantaged. If unequal social impact of infectious disease was predictable, then the discrete, inevitable, unequal economic outcomes for disabled people should have been obvious. They were obvious because disabled people in working age families are far more likely to be living in poverty than those who are not disabled. And nearly 50% of those people living in poverty going into the pandemic were either disabled themselves or lived with a disabled person. The disability employment gap was 28.6 percentage points in England, 31.9 points in Wales, 34.9 points in Scotland, and 42.3 points in Northern Ireland. The disability pay gap stood at 15.5%. Having a disability was also, as the inquiry has already concluded, one of the strongest predictors of digital exclusion. From many sources, and as the inquiry impact film contributor Hussein said this morning, the inquiry is aware that lockdown measures created their own cost of living crisis for disabled people, because as services were often abruptly withdrawn, disabled people had to fund those services for themselves, or parents had to find the equivalent for disabled children, and often in circumstances where assessments and reviews in relation to funding care plans were subject to easements, with backlogs on those assessments reaching several 100,000 by 2022. These matters about disabled people's means were known to government. Their ramifications were in fact stated openly in government workings about pandemic economic interventions. To quote a few examples from the initial months of March to May 2020, Disabled people were likely to be vulnerable to short-term income loss and were people with lower financial resilience who were likely to be particularly affected. Disabled people were amongst those most likely to be in serious financial difficulty. And among those in work, some disabled people will be less able to work from home and may be more economically vulnerable. Which brings us to our third matter, exclusion. How much do government interventions designed to protect against income loss and to address labour market instability involve a substantial and substantive response to the obvious needs of disabled people in terms of social and economic vulnerability, and especially the vulnerability generated by pandemic policies? My lady, in several instances, you will hear evidence of economic support interventions from which disabled people were excluded by design. This applied across the range of interventions affecting those who were looking for work, already in employment or self-employment, or unable to work. Kickstart, the government's flagship employment support program for young people looking for work, was launched in the knowledge that young people needed major targeted support. Kickstart was open to 16 to 24-year-olds receiving universal credit, but not to disabled young people receiving other benefits, including disability-related benefits. Several months into the scheme, in October 2020, the Equality Hub in the Cabinet Office asked, how is the Department for Work and Pensions and the Treasury ensuring that Kickstart delivers for young disabled people, a group that we know will be disproportionately negatively impacted by pandemic job loss? In February 2021, the Minister for Disabled People, Justin Tomlinson MP, belatedly asked the same question. But he did not press the matter to a resolution in favour of disabled young people, and the government maintained its stance of limiting Kickstart to those receiving universal credit. Disabled young people were left to await a potential further phase of Kickstart to run beyond the life of the current scheme. As your ladyship has just heard in Module 8, young people do not have time up their sleeve to await possible future schemes that are introduced after they've grown up and no longer qualify for them. On Kickstart, a COVID generation of young disabled job seekers was effectively abandoned. For disabled people who received benefits, exclusion was also done by design. Through no choice or fault of disabled benefit claimants themselves, the system is still in the process of an enormous shift to universal credit, which began to be rolled out as long ago as October 2013. By 2020, in some parts of the country, such as the whole of Northern Ireland, the move to universal credit rollout had not even started. The Chancellor of the Exchequer provided additional support through an additional £20 per week for universal credit claimants. In what the inquiry's labour market expert, Dr. Mike Brewer, describes as harsh justice, no equivalent uplift was provided to people receiving other so-called legacy benefits. My lady, this would be harsh justice in any times, all the more so in an economically devastating pandemic. This was exclusion from the government's primary measure to strengthen the safety net, which the Chancellor of the Exchequer said was supposed to benefit the nation's most vulnerable households. The ostensible justifications for this unfairness do not stand up. Pandemic help, we are told, was only for those who had suffered lost wages, even though those who happened to be on universal credit received the uplift irrespective of whether they were wage earners. The DWP, it is explained, was being impacted generally by the pandemic and increased reliance on the benefit systems by others who were new to it, which made additional extensions too difficult, even while HMRC was able to distribute furlough payments in a novel way. In more telling language from the DWP, it was apparently not feasible alongside other key priorities. And in more chilling language, the approach prioritised the safety and stability of the benefits system overall. A priority, it seems, over disabled people who are supposed to be served by that system equitably and fairly along with others. As with Kickstart, there is evidence that government acted in furtherance of other aims unrelated to the pandemic safety net, of making gains in the protracted move to universal credit and making savings on the transitional protections built into that process along the way, even if it meant a perverse economic outcome. Alongside such direct exclusion was apparent oversight and omission in design in other areas. Design of the scheme for the self-employed in relation to disabled people, who are more likely to experience fluctuations in income and interruptions of business continuity due to absences. Whether and how sick pay covered those who have to reduce their working hours or have fluctuating conditions and those with long COVID. How sick pay interacted with furlough, and whether community funding reached representative organisations. Which brings us to our final matter of policy design and the values which underpin that design. As with all aspects of the pandemic response, the economic response needed to cater for the human condition in all its manifestations. If it did not, it was a non-response. More broadly, better designed policies to assist disabled people could have been achieved by drawing on wider and more diverse expertise, including, as the inquiry has now found, by seeking advice informed by disabled people themselves. But other design shortcomings of the economic measures are more basic and frankly ideological. They were about supporting with billions of pounds people who had been able to work in a certain way, but who were temporarily unable to work. For DPO, COVID economics remained a comparatively small c conservative endeavour, designed to protect the status quo, cautious about changed provisions like sick pay, and wary of creating what were perceived as new dependencies that could become politically difficult to withdraw. One of the reasons that government was generally resistant to appreciating the obvious needs of disabled people during its improvised formation of pandemic policies is that there is an embedded tendency to see all economics around disabled people as resolved by low-paid or unpaid care, and a dedicatedly retrenched approach to benefits deemed to be a gift rather than a commitment to basic needs and dignity. My Lady, counsel at the inquiry referred this morning to the sharp increase in government borrowing and public debt to fund the pandemic economic interventions. Disabled people's fear is that they will, even now, have to pay the price of that borrowing without having shared equitably in its benefits. Thank you, my lady.
Speedy, thank you. And I'm sorry, I haven't told you all you've got to get your timings right. I got mine wrong. And I was premature in hurrying you along, so apologies. Thank you very much. Right. Smythe, you over there? Yep.
Thank you, my lady. I am timing myself. I appear for Child Poverty Action Group, which I will call CPAG. CPAG conducted extensive research during the pandemic about its impact on low-income families with children and the functioning of the social security system. And its work has been set out in more detail in its evidence to the inquiry, which highlights the financial hardship that low-income families with children experienced. CPAG submits that in its economic response, the UK government failed to recognise this hardship, let alone to act upon and mitigate it. And that was despite the fact that it was not just significant, but entirely foreseeable. In Module 8, the inquiry heard from the children's rights organisations, and that included CPAG, about a litany of failures to recognise and prioritise children's needs in any meaningful way, and about the serious and sustained impacts that that has had on children. The inquiry's Module 2 report recognises the severity of both the impact of the pandemic and the government's response to it on children, referring to the decisions to close schools and early years provision as having brought ordinary childhood to a halt. In particular, CPAG welcomes the inquiry's finding that for most children, the closure of schools, the inability to see friends, and the requirements to stay at home were of profound consequence and compounded disadvantages to which they were already subject. We would add that CPAG also welcomes the inquiry's recommendations in Module 2 that the UK government should introduce legislation to place child rights impact assessments on a statutory footing, and also that it should bring into force in England Section 1 of the Equality Act 2010, which implements the socio-economic duty. In this module, CPAG's position is that the same failure to pay enough attention to the impact on children identified in Module 2 underpinned the government's economic response. CPAG considers that children's rights and needs should have been at the absolute heart of that response. But instead, as I've said, those needs were not properly recognised, let alone taken into account in decision-making in any meaningful way. The consequence is that the pandemic has had a devastating impact on children growing up in poverty, and the full effects on their mental well-being, educational attainment and life chances are still yet to play out fully, but on any view, those consequences will be sustained and significant. So before we summarise what CPAG say were the key flaws in the economic response, it's important to understand why low-income families with children were not in a financial or social position to weather the financial and other costs of the pandemic. In our opening submissions last year, we explained what poverty actually is, essentially not having enough resources to meet a household's needs, or not having the living conditions that are widely accepted in society in which you live as being usual. When the pandemic hit, some 31% of children in the UK were growing up in poverty, and of those, 7 in 10 had at least one parent or carer in work. Families with children are, and indeed still are, more likely to be in poverty than the general population because of the additional costs of raising children and the effect of raising children on the hours that parents can work, and of course the fact that wages don't adjust for household size. That means that the social security system is particularly important for families with children as a way of supplementing their incomes. And while, of course, we absolutely recognise the remit of the inquiry, we do say that it's impossible to consider the effectiveness of the economic interventions without understanding the position when the UK entered the pandemic, and in particular the wider social security system in which the measures that were introduced took effect. So to give a snapshot, on the eve of the pandemic, policies which had been introduced since 2010, such as the benefit cap and the 2-child limit, had severed the connection between the level of need of a family and the level of social security support which they received. And those policies are explained in more detail in our written submissions. And as we've also noted in our written submissions, in 2020, the government had spent some £36 billion a year less on social security for children and families in real terms than it would have done had the various cuts and freezes not been introduced since 2010. And just to give a flavour, child benefit had lost 20% of its value in real terms, and other benefits were worth between 9 and 17% less in 2020 than they had been in 2010. The result then is that on the eve of the pandemic, some 4.3 million children were living in poverty, and benefit income levels were already inadequate to support the basic expenditure of many families with children. Given that context, those children were hit particularly hard by the pandemic. And again, just to give a flavour of what things were like in reality, With children unable to go to school, families needed to spend more on food, electricity, heating, resources for homeschooling and entertainment. Many low-income families had to find a way of buying devices, arranging for broadband access for their children just so that they could access education. And on top of that, the cost of accessing essential items such as groceries went up, while access to other family and community support, such as informal support or support from food banks or public services such as libraries, was either disrupted or simply not readily available. Against that background, we welcome the issues that have been highlighted this morning by Council to the inquiry, and we take this opportunity, if we may, to highlight 5 core issues which we invite the inquiry to consider in this module. So first, what were the government's objectives in its economic response, and particularly when it made decisions in relation to the social security system? And for example, did it prioritise providing help to people who would suffer the most financial hardship, or was its focus on other aims, such as providing support to the wider economy? Second, did the government assess or reassess the distinct needs of low-income families with children and how they were negatively impacted by the pandemic? And if so, when and how did it do this, and was this effective? Third, what options to target support at families with children were considered, and why were no targeted measures ultimately implemented? Fourth, what were the consequences for families with children when support like the £20 uplift was later removed? And finally, in designing its economic interventions, or in failing later to adjust them or remove them, did the government know that some people, including families with children, would be left in deep poverty and even destitute, and fail to do anything about it? Based on the material that CPAG has already seen from the inquiry, and based on its own experience during the pandemic, which the inquiry will be hearing about, we highlight at this stage 3 core and fundamental failings in the government's economic response. First, in the early part of the pandemic, the government failed properly to recognise the foreseeable economic impacts of the pandemic on low-income families with children. Key decisions were made without appreciating the reality of home life for many. We say that this is illustrated by the comment we highlight in paragraph 39 of our written submissions, that by receiving an extra £20, existing benefit claimants were receiving a windfall. Actually, families living in poverty, most of whom are in work, were the subject of seriously increased financial pressures, and their income, even with that £20 uplift, was inadequate to meet those pressures. So far from receiving any kind of windfall, many were devastated by the pandemic. Second, because it failed properly to identify those who were most likely to be adversely affected in economic terms, the government didn't set out to design economic interventions to help those people, and nor did it adjust them in the face of clear evidence of ongoing financial hardship. And CPAG ultimately submits that the UK government should have identified, but didn't, as one of the core objectives of its economic interventions, the protection of people who were most likely to experience financial hardship during the pandemic, especially children in low-income families. Instead, it focused on protecting the UK economy and neglected to provide adequate support for the most economically vulnerable. And third, and again, while of course respecting the remit of the inquiry, CPAG say that the continuation of policies during the pandemic, which severed the connection between need and the level of support, and the key examples there being the benefit cap and the 2-child limit, was manifestly inappropriate. Starting with the benefit cap, the 2 options available to individuals to escape that cap, either working more or moving house, were practically impossible and obviously contrary to the government's public health measures. And as to the £20 uplift, of course CPAG recognise that the situation of families would have been worse without it, but it was a blunt tool, as crucially it didn't take account of family size. And then even worse, and as counsel to the inquiry has said this morning, despite the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions recommending that the £20 uplift be made permanent, made up of a £10 additional standard allowance and a £10 additional child element, that support be introduced. That support was in fact withdrawn in 2021 at a time when families were still dealing with the financial consequences of the pandemic which we've described. Finally then, in terms of solutions, CPAG's core point is that the default mechanism for getting financial support to children in low-income families in future emergencies must be an improved social security system, which is not structured so as to disadvantage families with children. That would help to ensure that families are in a stronger position going into any future crisis, as well as ensuring that the system is ready to provide support to those who most need it in the event of another national emergency. And CPAG also hopes that the inquiry's investigation will scrutinise how we can best ensure that in any future civil emergency, the realities of those experiencing financial hardship, including children in poverty, are better understood by decision makers, and that consideration of their rights and needs are embedded into future economic responses. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Smythe. Ms Hannett.
My Lady, I appear on behalf of the long COVID groups along with Ms Siva Kumaran, instructed by Jane Ryan of Bat Murphy Solicitors. The long COVID groups in this module are Long COVID Support and Long COVID SOS. They are grassroots advocacy organisations whose members came together in the early days of the pandemic to achieve recognition of long COVID. They advocate for the recognition of the economic harms caused by long COVID and represent those affected. In this module, the long COVID groups will provide evidence on the adverse effects of long COVID on their members' economic circumstances. Members of the long COVID groups have lost their income entirely or seen it reduced dramatically. Their careers have been damaged or destroyed, rendering many unable to provide financially for themselves and for their families. My Lady, this module commences immediately after the publication of your report on Module 2. That report makes a number of findings which will inform your investigation of the economic response. Relevantly, you found first that the potential for long-term illnesses to occur was predictable. You concluded second that sufficient information was available by October 2020 for decision makers to understand that long COVID was a significant health and policy issue to be tackled. Third, you found that the UK government, in particular the then Prime Minister, Mr Johnson, was slow to acknowledge the seriousness and prevalence of long COVID and to direct that greater attention be paid to how it could be addressed, mitigated and taken into account in decision-making on strategy. These findings informed your recommendations that in future pandemics, considerations of long-term sequelae must be built into any strategy and supporting plans. And further, you recommended that the potential for long-term sequelae, as well as the developing understanding of them, should be communicated to the public. My Lady, precisely the same failings are apparent in the approach of the UK government and the devolved nations to the economic response to long COVID. First, the existence of long-term sequelae was foreseeable and should have been planned for. But in any event, the long COVID groups advocated for economic measures to assist their members from the very earliest stages of the pandemic. For example, Long COVID SOS wrote to the Prime Minister and all members of Parliament on the 3rd of July 2020, calling for the recognition of long COVID and asking for action to be taken to consider, and I quote, the economic implications, including making provision for long-term sick leave, financial support, and taking steps to ensure employers were made fully aware of this situation. Certainly, by November 2020, the Treasury were well aware of the catastrophic economic impact of long COVID on individuals and were aware of its significance for the wider economy. For example, in email exchanges in November 2020, Treasury officials recognised that the economic costs of long COVID causing workers to be unable to work had not been accounted for. Dr. Tim Lunig also advised in November 2020 that the increasing number of long COVID sufferers was a further factor weighing in favour of maintaining restrictions until the wider populations were vaccinated. And certainly by the 19th of July 2020, the Cabinet Office, in a document entitled In-Depth Risks Associated with High COVID-19 Prevalence, referred to one of the 4 key risks associated with high COVID-19 prevalence as being more long COVID workforce absences, including in the NHS, and noted that high prevalence will almost certainly increase the health and economic burden of long COVID. Further, it stated that the long-term impact of long COVID on workforce absences and productivity was currently unknown, but likely to be significant. Second, while you concluded in Module 2 that decision makers had been slow to respond to the threats posed by long COVID, in the context of the economic threats posed to the individual, to the public purse, and to the wider economy, the evidence discloses a total failure to respond at all. Specifically, none of the relevant witnesses in Module 9 reviewed the existing economic interventions as more information became available. The highest any of the witnesses puts it to you is the Treasury, who say that they maintained an interest in long COVID. The department responsible for alleviating economic hardship, Department for Work and Pensions, apparently failed to take any specific action in response to long COVID. In July 2021, a COVID-19 task force paper identified the Department for Health and Social Care and the Department for Work and Pensions as responsible for preparing a strategy to address the cumulative impact of long COVID on public and private sector workforces. But none of the witnesses for DWP explain whether a strategy was developed or how DWP responded to the known impact of long COVID on the workforce. As of today, there are and have not been any economic interventions targeted at those with long COVID. The long COVID groups say that there should have been. Neither has any information about long COVID been communicated to employers or benefits assessors, despite a lack of understanding or even disbelief about long COVID being a significant barrier to people with long COVID both remaining in work and accessing benefits. For example, DWP has not reviewed its assessments to ensure that they are able to understand the relapsing and remitting nature of long COVID. Third, as you concluded in Module 2, in future pandemics, economic interventions to mitigate the harm caused by long-term sequelae must be built into the economic response. The inquiry's expert, Dr. Mike Brewer, suggests that labour market interventions are not relevant to long COVID. Similarly, some of the government experts say that long COVID should be treated just as any other chronic condition. Our clients do not accept this. We invite the inquiry to cast a critical eye over the evidence and to reach its own finding on whether long COVID should have been factored into economic interventions. In particular, the long COVID groups make the following 3 points. First, the scale of suffering attributable to long COVID should not be underestimated. The last ONS data from March 2024, confirming that 1.5 million people's daily activities are limited by long COVID and 381,000 are limited a lot, suggests that the contribution due to long COVID is significant. And this tallies with a reported increase since the pandemic of people who are economically inactive for health reasons and an increase in people working with health-limiting conditions. The UK government recognised in July 2021 in COVID-0 advice, considering the high prevalence of infection that summer, that there would be worker shortages caused by increased illness, including long COVID. Yet there has been no comprehensive survey of the economic impact of long COVID. Evidence relied on by the Treasury to suggest that the contribution of long COVID to economic inactivity is smaller than expected is outdated and not truly representative, given that it was gathered prior to June 2021, when statutory sick pay may have hidden the true scale of the impact. Second, providing targeted support for people with long COVID would have fulfilled 2 of the Treasury's key economic objectives, namely, first, preventing unemployment and supporting living standards, and second, protecting the most vulnerable. The long COVID group surveys documented that many people had to leave their jobs following extended periods of sick leave due to long COVID. Reforms to statutory sick pay and guidance to employers about long COVID were mitigations which could have preserved work and prevented the scarring effects of unemployment. Further, long COVID disproportionately affected women and people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Again, targeted support would have mitigated the disproportionate impacts of long COVID. Third, there's a moral and ethical imperative to provide targeted financial support for people with long COVID. People who served on the front line in healthcare, transport, and other essential key worker roles were at disproportionate risk of suffering from long COVID. And whilst there was some support for NHS workers by way of COVID sick pay until 2022, other key workers did not receive any support, despite sacrificing their health to work throughout the pandemic. As of 2022, there was no support for people who suffered long COVID from workplace infections, and the implications we say for the future are profound. Knowing that long-term sequelae are foreseeable, how can we ask frontline workers to serve again without a guarantee that if their health is damaged, they'll be properly looked after? The long COVID groups would like to know why nothing has been done to alleviate the suffering of those with long COVID. And we say, so far, 3 themes have emerged from the evidence, which offer some explanation and warrant further investigation in this module. We say, first, the lack of response is a function of disbelief in or indifference to long COVID. The inquiry has already found in Module 2 that this attitude affected the UK government's approach to long COVID generally, and we say that's equally apparent in the failure to respond to its economic impact. Second, we say the economic impact of long COVID required a whole systems approach, namely a cross-departmental government response. This didn't occur, and to the contrary, each relevant government department abdicated responsibility to another. Third, the inquiry's expert, Dr. Tetlow, has concluded that there was a failure to integrate economic and public health evidence. This was seen particularly acutely in the context of long COVID. To the extent it was considered at all by the UK government, long COVID was approached as a public health problem only, and not as a public health problem with a discrete economic impact. In summary, as we observe in our written opening submissions, long COVID has long consequences. Those consequences include adverse effects on health, but also individual and wider societal economic impacts. And yet, despite these impacts being foreseeable at the outset of the pandemic, and certainly known about by later in 2020, the government failed to introduce interventions to support people with long COVID to remain in work or to access the support they were told was available. Lady, we conclude with 2 points. First, we would like to pay tribute to Ondine Sherwood, a co-founder of Long COVID SOS, who died in March 2025. Ondine advocated for those with long COVID from early in 2020 and indeed gave evidence to you in Module 2. Much of the evidence presented by the long COVID groups in this module builds on Ondine's brilliant and tenacious campaigning. Second, we thank the inquiry for the opportunity to participate in Module 9, and we look forward to helping the inquiry in its work. Unless I can be of further assistance, my lady, those are the opening submissions of the long COVID groups.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Hannard. Very grateful. We seem to have lost Ms Stober at the moment. I hope she's okay, but that means we're going to have to move people up. But next it's Mr Jacobs.
My lady, these are the submissions of the Trades Union Congress. They address the importance of the labour market interventions, the contribution of social partnership to those interventions, the need to fill the gaps, the need for a stronger social security net, and the Treasury's decision-making on matters outside of its core interests. First, the importance of the labour market interventions. A great many of the 5 million members of the TUC-affiliated unions were supported by the labour market interventions introduced during the pandemic. The interventions were bold, and because they were bold, they came at a significant cost to the public purse. But it is also because they were bold that they substantially achieved their objectives and reduced long-term damage to the economy. The TUC considers that a critical part of the work of this module is to recognise the value of these labour market interventions in mitigating the harms of the pandemic. They avoided mass redundancies, limited damage to and loss of self-employed businesses, and reduced the severity of long-term economic scarring. By July 2021, 11.6 million people and 1.3 million employers had used the CJRS. It is estimated that the CJRS directly protected around 4 million jobs and that 250,000 employers who used the scheme would have closed permanently without it. The SEISS was also hugely important. Dr. Tim Lunig, economic advisor to the Chancellor, has suggested that the scheme had a moral and political rationale rather than an economic one, as the UK already has an income support scheme in universal credit. That, however, fails to recognise that many self-employed would be eligible only for very limited support, if any, due to savings and assets, and in any event, the income provided by universal credit would have represented a significant drop in earnings for most self-employed people. Many self-employed people would not be able to support themselves and meet the costs of sustaining their businesses during a lockdown without support. The resulting economic scarring would have been significant. The inquiry should also consider the unquantifiable but vast consequences of mass redundancies and loss of livelihood in terms of impact on mental health and increased levels of poverty and associated consequences of that for the lives of children, those at risk of domestic violence, and myriad other impacts. There is evidence, as set out in our written submission, as to the particular scarring effects on young people of time out of the labour market. My lady, sometimes the best lessons to learn are actually about what went well, and the core elements of the CJRS and SEISS are an example. In a future pandemic, reductions in spend on such interventions, which severely restrict their capacity to achieve the objectives of protecting jobs and livelihoods, will not achieve value for money at all. To take a hypothetical example, significantly lowering the level of income replacement from 80% would reduce the initial outlay but thwart the benefit of the intervention. The value of providing income protection at or above 80% of usual earnings is an important lesson learned from this pandemic. As observed, it was successful because it was bold. This morning, your lead counsellor in this module, entirely appropriately, canvassed a line of thinking that interventions aimed at preserving the labour market going into the pandemic may not be effective in assisting the economy coming out of it, that it might preserve an economy for conditions that may not exist coming out of the pandemic, that it might suppress a churn in employment in which economies thrive, that it might suppress innovation, that it might support the survival of businesses that are not otherwise viable. My lady, putting to one side the merits of that as an economic theory in normal times, in the midst of national lockdowns in a global pandemic, the notion of not providing support to see who sinks and swims would be utterly disastrous. A great many would sink, and not because they aren't great or innovative businesses. The damage to individuals and the economy in the short and long term would be disastrous. Second, my lady, the contribution of social partnership to the labour market interventions. The TUC called for and in substantial part was able to work in successful partnership with the government in developing these interventions. Going into the pandemic, there was an absence of established and utilised frameworks for partnership working. That had the disadvantage that in the midst of responding to significant and unfamiliar challenges, arrangements for partnership working had to be established from something akin to a blank slate. The problem fits into a broader picture as to engagement with stakeholders. Structures for partnership working are not limited to unions, and no doubt this module will receive evidence from stakeholders who are significantly constrained in their engagement with government on issues key to this module. Nonetheless, on many of the core issues, there was meaningful and effective engagement between key government departments, the TUC, and a number of unions. Kate Bell, the TUC's Assistant General Secretary, describes in her statement the intensity of that engagement, particularly in the early phases of the pandemic. It is echoed by the evidence of the then Chancellor, who says that while economic interventions during the pandemic were developed at pace, understanding the views of recipients or the views of key stakeholders involved in delivery was central to the design of policy. In looking to a future pandemic or other crisis, the benefits of partnership working should be harnessed, the TUC says, by way of a tripartite panel of government, businesses and unions, brought together to work through and refine the labour market interventions in advance of a future pandemic. My lady, the third issue is the gaps in the labour market interventions. Many workers fell through the gaps. For some, those gaps meant that they were not eligible for any support, whether under the SEISS or the CJRS. For others, the support available represented a significant and unaffordable drop in their incomes. Workers in both categories were in many cases pushed into the welfare system, and the gaps had a disproportionate impact on those in low-paid and insecure work and upon those in the creative industries. A short oral submission in opening is not the place for detailing the gaps, but they included the delay in introducing the provision for those in self-employment, those in freelance, zero-hour or short-term PAYE work, those whose employers chose to decide not to make use of furlough, the cliff edge created by a system whereby employees needed to work all of their hours or none at all, and those whose earnings were at minimum wage who saw their income drop to below minimum wage. My lady, why is it important to fill the gaps? Or does filling the gaps just create more of a burden on the public purse? We say that filling the gaps is firstly about effectiveness and maximising effectiveness of the interventions in terms of preventing job losses and loss of business. The long-term protection of the economy is better served by filling the gaps. Secondly, it is about policy coherence and fairness. Many of the gaps arose due to the hasty creation of the schemes rather than the pursuit of a cogent policy objective. It would be fairer and better policy making if these gaps were filled. And behind the gaps are thousands who suffered the severe economic effects of the pandemic without support that was desperately needed. And several of the powerful accounts of the impact film this morning were precisely the accounts of those who fell in the gaps. Third, it is about inequality. Those on lowest incomes and those in precarious work were most likely to miss out. It is a point about which the TUC is especially concerned. And this, my lady, is a practical way that this inquiry can seek to address the devastating unequal impact which inevitably rises during a pandemic or other whole-of-society crisis. So work should be done now in partnership to prepare more complete schemes for support. The TUC also considers that the lack of a pre-existing short-time working scheme in the UK contributed to the gaps in the CJRS. Whereas other countries were able to refine and adapt pre-existing schemes to the present crisis, the UK had to scramble to create schemes from scratch. Inevitably, in the scrabble, lacunas emerged. The TU considers that the significant benefits of having a standing scheme, for which practical and contractual features are already fully worked through and with which stakeholders are familiar, will be underlined by the evidence in this module. The fourth issue is the need for a stronger social security net. The TUC and its affiliated unions held concerns about inadequacies in universal credit, which were exacerbated during the pandemic. The 5-week wait for universal credit and the savings cap, which dramatically tapers payments when the claimant has over £6,000 of savings, were particular areas of concern. The TUC noted in its April 2020 report entitled Fixing the Safety Net that the best way to protect incomes was to keep people in work, but that many more people were already at that point having to turn to the social security system. On a number of occasions, the TUC made the case for the basic level of income support to be raised to 80% of the national living wage, or £260 per week. Limitations in the safety net also made it more difficult to adhere to self-isolation. The inquiry has observed in its Module 2 report many of those in low-paid professions had no option but to go out to work, and they faced additional risks of becoming infected by COVID-19. They then faced financial hardship if they self-isolated. For people on low pay who struggle to pay for the basics, these hardships, or their consequences, should not be underestimated. They also had significant public health implications with regard to potential onward transmission. My lady, of course, the TUC welcomes that finding and says that it is part of the problem is the extraordinarily low rate of and narrow eligibility for statutory sick pay. Fifthly and finally, we turn to Treasury decision-making on matters outside its core interest. In several modules, the inquiry has heard evidence about responses to the pandemic that require money, and the Treasury offering resistance as it manages the public purse and ensures value for money. It is a proper responsibility of the Treasury. But it is also a feature of decision-making that whereas the Treasury could be resistant to the interests and concerns of other departments, it was more persuadable in respect of its own. The TUC considers that the Treasury was most effective and responsive on matters related to the Treasury's primary concern, the wider economy, but it was less persuadable on issues of public health response, social and mental health impacts, and widening health inequalities, unless linked to wider economic impacts and the state of the economy. This featured during the pandemic in a number of respects, perhaps most significantly the gaps in the labour market interventions, the resistance to changing statutory sick pay and financially supporting self-isolation, and its resistance to enhancing the social security safety net. My lady, those are the submissions of the TUC. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Jacobs. Mr. Lissack.
May it please you, my lady, in this matter I appear on behalf of the British Business Bank, together with learned friend Miss Emily Wilson, instructed by Claire Whittle of DLA. In this short opening statement, I would like to touch on three themes. Each, I hope, will chime with the opening approach of Council to the inquiry this morning. First, the humanity of what the world endured during COVID-19, viewed through the lens of the bank. Secondly, the bank's role in the schemes. Thirdly, the financial outcome of those schemes. First, the humanity of it all. Your Ladyship has, over the course of the inquiry to date, heard detailed and moving evidence about the toll the pandemic took on individuals, families, and businesses. It hardly needs me to underline that to you. Rather, we wish to make 2 points. First, the bank wishes me to emphasize that it recognizes the significant impact which the pandemic had and offers its sincere condolences to those who lost loved ones and to recognize the price paid by those who suffered mentally, physically, and financially. All captured so evocatively in the impact film played at the start of this module, a film that no one could have found easy to watch. Secondly, my lady, the bank pays tribute to its staff and those with whom they collaborated, who worked 7 days a week from early morning to late evening, adapting simultaneously to the same dislocating pandemic-related disruptions to their personal and family lives that we all suffered, but at the same time managing the demands of unprecedented financial policy implementation. Without their commitment, the bank would have struggled to discharge its role at scale and in a dramatically compressed time frame, when failure to deliver would have had a significant adverse effect on the survival of many businesses and millions of jobs during the pandemic. To our second point, the bank's role. It is important, my lady, that we emphasize what the bank's role was and what it was not. As Council to the Inquiry said this morning, it is less than clear where the lines of reporting of responsibility lay. We wish to emphasize this because the contours of division as to role as regards the schemes that existed between the bank and government were not always obvious, as is evidenced by what Council of the Inquiry said earlier this morning, to those on the outside looking in, and consequentially the boundary between the role of the bank and the role of central government and ministers has not always been well understood in public commentary either at the time or since. So, first, the government's role. It originated, designed and approved the pandemic schemes with which this module is concerned. It determined the size of the interventions, the timing of the schemes, and the accreditation criteria for each of them. The bank's role was very different. Its core duty was the launch and operation of these schemes as mandated by the government, and in addition, it provided advice to government and assistance as and when needed. It acted as a conduit between lenders and government and played a coordinating role during the operation of the schemes, working with the lenders. Throughout, my lady, the bank remained active in trying to identify ways to minimise fraud by borrowers and resultant losses, and continues to review lender performance on recovery from borrowers and the lender's own claims under the guarantee, adjusting where there were errors or issues with the loans. But this should be understood, if I may emphasise it. The work required of the bank to launch and operate the schemes was immensely challenging. All this was introduced in extraordinary time spans and under extreme pressure. By way of example, there was just 16 days from its inception to the operation of the Bounce Back Loan Scheme, 16 days. The work went far beyond the capacity of which the bank, as it existed in early 2020, had been designed. Indeed, the task required an exponential development of the bank in the most difficult circumstances. For example, its headcount went from 250 before COVID to 600 after COVID. It went from supporting 98,000 businesses with 8 billion of finance before COVID to supporting about 1.65 million businesses with 82 billion of funding post-COVID. This exponential development has been informed by lessons learned on many fronts and has led to its capacity, its systems and its processes all being significantly enhanced and evolved from those in place pre-pandemic. It's resulted in the bank having a model for future emergency lending, and the bank being in a much better position to support the UK government and economy in the event of any future shock. Third and last, the financial outcome of the schemes. The bank wishes to emphasise these three things. First, and whilst we recognise, my lady, not directly a matter for the bank itself, its perception is that these schemes that eventuated reflected what could be achieved given the time available and the parameters set by government. Secondly, it is recognised that if the schemes were run again, they would benefit from the knowledge and experience gained through the disaster of this pandemic. Third, inherent in these schemes, delivered as they were at scale and speed, as mandated by the government, were risks identified by the bank, known by government, but accepted by government given the dramatic economic emergency we all faced. The bank recognises this is not a time to be blasé. There is rightly public concern about the level of fraud and error and the impact on public spending via the government guarantees. This is a concern that the bank shares and on which it provided clear and robust advice in real time. But bearing in mind, my lady, the level of risk that the bank originally identified in its reservation notices, which are, as you know, formal letters sent by the bank to the Secretary of State, highlighting specific risks of relevant schemes, the actual level of identified fraud and the overall ineffectiveness in terms of jobs and livelihoods may, on final analysis, prove to be better than some commentators would have it. So this should also be said. The positive impact of the schemes is undoubted. That leapt large from the screen in the film we saw at the beginning of this module. And when looking at what went wrong, it is important to do that in the context of what went right. From data effective as at the end of June 2025, these facts can be distilled. First, that £82 billion of finance was delivered through the schemes. Secondly, but for the government guarantees, lenders would not have been willing and able to provide billions of pounds of lending, nor at such speed, meaning that many businesses that stayed afloat would have sunk with the consequential loss of employment. Thirdly, as regards the rate of repayment, 4 points can be made by volume, meaning by counting the number of individual loans published for the period ending the 30th of June 2025 and set out in our written opening, paragraph 55 and following. the picture is encouraging. The vast majority of loans are fully repaid or on schedule. Of the remainder, the number the bank anticipates to be default is lower than initially projected. And looking at the value of the loans made and the ultimate amount which it is likely to be spent on the government guarantee, the picture is broadly even better. The fourth general point we'd make is to pick up on a point that was made by my learned friend in his opening address this morning. On bounce-back loans, which has the highest level of suspected fraud attendant to it, as you know, lenders have flagged about 4% of the 46.48 billion of drawdown value as suspected fraud. In no sense does the bank take this level of loss lightly, but it must be seen as the price paid for the delivery of the schemes at scale, at speed, in extremis. And finally, my lady, may I emphasise this. All this must be set against the fact that the schemes provided tens of billions, initial estimates suggest up to £77 billion, of additional gross value added to the UK economy. And as a result, hundreds of thousands of businesses and up to 3.5 million jobs were saved. With that, we leave these opening submissions. We'll thank you for allowing us to make them, and we stand ready to assist the inquiry in any way we can over the weeks to come.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Lissack. Our timing is going to be a bit out today, so I think the suggestion is that I should break now and we'll see if we can make some inquiries, even more inquiries about Ms. Dover, and I shall return at 3:10. I'm afraid Ms. Dover won't be with us this afternoon, so Mr. Mitchell.
Thank you, my lady. This is the opening statement for the Scottish Government. I appear today along with Junior Counsel Michael Way, and we are instructed by Fraser Johnston Roberts and Ian Wallace of the Scottish Government Legal Directorate. Although it may have begun as a health crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic soon became an economic crisis. Epidemiological requirement necessitated non-pharmaceutical interventions. In turn, NPIs necessitated financial support. The Scottish Government introduced measures to address the impact of the various NPIs. It also provided support to ensure that the measures were effective in achieving their desired aim. This included considering any additional impacts on the vulnerable in society and those who suffered the effects of inequality. In this opening statement, we examine some of the ways in which the Scottish Government sought to alleviate economic hardship. We look at some issues that arose, and we consider improvements that could be made to a future emergency economic response that would allow the Scottish Government to make full use of its devolved powers and thereby to respond in an optimal manner. At the outset, it's important to highlight that the Scottish Government's economic activities are not overseen by the same Director General that has responsibility and oversight for fiscal strategy and management. The economic response was led by DG Economy, while fiscal strategy was led by DG Scottish Exchequer. They work closely together. Economy made policy recommendations to ministers about support schemes and economic interventions, and ministers considered advice from Exchequer on the extent and means available to fund those schemes and interventions. Looking firstly then at some of the challenges that were faced. Difficulties arose through unaltered reliance on existing funding mechanisms in place with the UK Government. Normal borrowing arrangements and the overall fiscal framework between the two governments continued to apply during the civil emergency. These mechanisms were neither designed nor adequate for responding to the pace and scale of the spending. The Scottish Government could not borrow in order to support additional spending that ministers may have felt was required. The financial resource available to make policy decisions, including on economic interventions, was directly dependent on UK Government policy decisions on spending. Decisions regarding NPIs had to take account of the levels of infection and transmission rate of the virus. That was the primary guiding metric in the initial period. But deployment of support was constrained by the inability to predict the level of funding that would be made available. Early on, the Scottish Government asked for more flexibility to allow for greater autonomy and timely spending decisions. The eventual response was the Barnett Guarantee of July 2020. Whilst that provided a welcome upfront commitment, namely that the Scottish Government would receive a minimum level of funds as a result of UK decisions, in practice, questions around timings of announcements and ongoing revisions to the level of guaranteed funding resulted in ongoing uncertainty and an opportunity cost. With more assurance around timing and amount, the Scottish Government would have had greater flexibility to respond more effectively to emerging local priorities and could potentially have taken decisions to apply support earlier. The Scottish Government made a commitment that any consequentials related to support for businesses in England would be passed on in full to Scottish businesses. In practice, the support available exceeded the related Barnett consequentials by £500 million. This reflected the Scottish economy's distinct features, the spread of the virus, and the need for different restrictions. A recommendation should be considered to review the fiscal frameworks, specifically adjustments that cater for a pandemic crisis so as to facilitate mutual rapid responses and financial risk management. The ability to respond at pace to a crisis would be best served by having prior agreement with the UK Government as to how the fiscal framework can be adapted, as well as having an upfront agreed approach and consultation on how UK-wide measures might best suit all four nations. We explore this in detail in our written opening statement, along with some of the recommendations of the expert David Phillips. One of the key challenges was obtaining timely data to monitor the impact of the pandemic and the MPIs to be put in place. Considerable progress was made by the Scottish Government's Office of the Chief Economic Advisor in conjunction with the Office for National Statistics and the other DAs. And the Scottish Government did make considerable use of analysis and expertise. For example, the Chief Economist presented analysis at weekly meetings chaired by the First Minister and attended weekly meetings of UK-wide ministerial economy ministers. However, difficulties arose in identifying businesses that required support. For businesses without premises on which non-domestic rates were applicable, the Scottish Government developed a range of targeted funds aimed at those sectors that could not access the main grant schemes. The information on individual businesses was held by HMRC and was not available to the Scottish Government at an individual business level. A future need was identified for sharing of HMRC and DWP data. Cultural, technical and legislative barriers currently exist. The Scottish Government has appointed a data liaison officer to liaise with the Cabinet Office and other DAs to establish ways of working during crises. Further, a Memorandum of Understanding was signed in July 2025, which outlines mechanisms to enable rapid sharing of data and analysis between UK and Scottish governments. Turning now to support for businesses. The Scottish Government implemented bespoke funding to augment that from the UK Government. This was more reflective of the differing rate of infection in Scotland, the distinct features of the Scottish economy, and the nature of the businesses that comprise it. Mr. Jacobs spoke a short while ago for the TUC in relation to the filling of gaps. A great amount of the Scottish Government's efforts in this respect went to fill gaps identified in UK Government support. The Scottish Government provided over £4.7 billion in support for businesses. This was not intended to, nor could it, fully compensate businesses for the losses that they faced, but it was a contribution towards costs that might be incurred when complying with restrictions, to ensure that, when lifted, businesses could return to operation. On 17 March 2020, the initial UK Government funding package was increased to £330 billion. On 18 March, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Kate Forbes, set out details of Phase 1 funds, including a similar package of NDR relief. There were two specific reliefs. One of them, the 100% relief, was based on the equivalent relief in England, which recognised that these sectors were most likely to be directly affected by restrictions, but with some local variation. Also on 18 March, the Small Business Grant Fund and the Retail, Hospitality and Leisure Grant Fund were announced. These schemes were initially based on the design of the English schemes with some, often significant, variation. The non-domestic rates system had formed the initial basis of support, as the non-domestic property valuation rule contains details of all such properties in Scotland. This information, held by local authorities, was considered to be the only way to deliver business support at scale and speed in the early days. Local government played a vital role in the administration of NDR relief and more broadly in the distribution of grants and funds in Scotland. Initial support was delivered via local authorities and targeted toward the specific sectors and businesses most impacted by MPIs. The Scottish Government considers that its working relationship with COSLA regarding the economic response was strong and effective. In April 2020, the chief economist had published estimates of the potential impact of COVID-19 on the economy. These early estimates, quite accurate compared with outturn, suggested GDP would reduce by 33% and, in the absence of support, unemployment would rise to 14% over the first lockdown period. There were over 130 Scottish Government business support funds in operation at various times during the pandemic. The total value of funding paid in 2020 to 21 and 21 to 22 was over £4.73 billion, of which £1.46 billion was NDR relief, £728 million was sectoral funding, and £2.54 billion was local authority-delivered funds. Some funds were highly targeted and modest in size, while others were broad and combined to pay out over £1 billion in support. The introduction of the strategic framework in Scotland at the end of October 2020 enabled a new approach, linking business support to the application of the levels and the associated package of restrictions. These Phase 2 funds were designed and delivered by local government, working with Scottish Government officials. They provided flexibility and autonomy for local authorities to decide how best to support economic recovery in their own areas. Bus-related initiatives proposed by Transport Scotland and approved and funded by the Scottish Government saw £223 million of funding to support bus operators until 31st March 2022. This kept essential services running and offset rising fuel, energy and staffing costs. Rail and ferry services were supported through variations to existing subsidy arrangements. This funding bridged the gap caused by physical distancing and reduced capacity between operating costs and lost fare revenue. The funding covered both commercial and local authority-supported bus services, rail and ferries. Considering the effectiveness of the schemes, in September of 2021, the Chief Economic Advisor considered that support provided by the Scottish Government, focused on small businesses and sectors most impacted by lockdown, had provided complementary support to the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme and had an additional impact on business survival over and above the UK schemes. The risk of fraud was mitigated through control mechanisms built into the scheme's design and delivery, with many grants administered by local authorities. They could use existing administrative capabilities, including fraud detection and prevention, and a well-established, robust existing NDR dataset to allow businesses to be paid quickly with appropriate checks. The approach taken by the Scottish Government to the risk of fraud and error was it is submitted appropriate and proportionate. Audit Scotland stated that this was something of a success story compared to the fraud issues which may be seen elsewhere in the evidence. In terms of alleviating hardship via business support, consideration was explicitly given to the importance of some sectors to particular communities in Scotland, and particularly where there were fewer alternative economic or employment opportunities. This was part of the underpinning rationale for the seafood industry support schemes. Turning to support for jobs in the self-employed, the Scottish Government introduced its own key economic interventions to support jobs. The newly self-employed hardship fund was set up to provide hardship relief to newly self-employed individuals who lost revenue but who were ineligible for the UK-wide scheme because they had registered with HMRC as self-employed within the previous year. It was designed by the Scottish Government in partnership with local authorities who also implemented them. The furlough support grant was made available in 5 health board areas for businesses that had to close down due to increased restrictions between 9th and 31st October 2020. The grant's purpose was to help meet the cost of furloughing staff by supporting the 20% employer's contribution that they were required to pay at that time under the UK-wide scheme. These businesses were primarily within the hospitality sector, which employs a disproportionately high number of people from groups with protected characteristics, particularly young people, women and minority ethnic groups. Turning finally, my lady, to the alleviation of economic hardship. Support for businesses, jobs and the self-employed was, of course, only part of a wider programme of actions to alleviate economic hardships within Scotland's communities. For example, Scotland remains the only nation in the UK to have made, in addition to other benefits, a Scottish child payment, which was a very significant anti-poverty measure. Also, on 18th March 2020, a £350 million package of resources was set out to support the third sector, communities and vulnerable individuals. This package benefited, amongst others, the Scottish Welfare Fund, allowing it to provide community care grants and crisis grants to those in immediate need. The package also allowed the setting up of a resilience fund administered by Firstport, Social Investment Scotland and the Cora Foundation. It helped save organisations with a collective turnover of approximately £500 million and safeguarded 14,000 jobs. In conclusion, my lady, we trust that this opening statement has been of some assistance in understanding the position of the Scottish Government on some of the main pillars of its economic response. While we have dealt exclusively with economic hardships, the Scottish Government does not forget the many forms of suffering experienced by the people of Scotland during the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Mitchell. Ms Walters.
Prynawn da, my lady. In this module, you've received 13 written statements from the Welsh Government, together with a written opening statement, all of which provide substantial detail insofar as the Welsh Government's economic response to the pandemic. As your ladyship will of course be aware, legislative competence for fiscal, economic and monetary policy, employment duties and social security schemes is generally reserved to the UK Government. There are of course exceptions to these, and these have been detailed in the written evidence provided where relevant. My lady, it is intended in this short oral statement to concentrate upon two main issues. Firstly and mainly, the funding and support provided by the UK Government to the Welsh Government during the relevant period. Secondly, and your ladyship may be pleased to hear more succinctly, the Welsh Government designed economic interventions. My lady, turning first, if I may then, to the issue of funding for the Welsh Government during the relevant period. Your ladyship has already heard considerable evidence in other modules regarding the fiscal framework governing public expenditure in the UK. As your ladyship again will be aware, approximately 80% of the Welsh Government's annual financial resource is allocated by His Majesty's Treasury via the block grant. That block grant is then subject to adjustments determined using the Barnett formula, which factors in, amongst other matters, Wales's comparable population. This then results in either positive consequential funding, where funds will be provided to the Welsh Government, or negative consequential funding, where funds will be clawed back from the Welsh Government. In non-pandemic times, notification of which of these applies and the quantum thereof usually occurs relatively late in the financial year. Now, the Welsh Government acknowledges that the general fiscal framework is a politically sensitive area that sits beyond the scope of the inquiry and your ladyship's considerations. However, its operation in pandemic times is fundamental to your ladyship's consideration of the devolved government's ability to appropriately respond to the economic needs of their respective nations during such times. Its business as usual design renders the Welsh Government wholly reliant upon the discretion of His Majesty's Treasury to depart from or grant flexibilities in respect of the framework to enable it to properly support the required economic response. In making this statement, the Welsh Government repeats its gratitude for the extent of funding and support provided by His Majesty's Treasury during the pandemic. As the inquiry will hear during this module, that support enabled the creation of national support schemes under reserved powers and the creation of complementary support schemes in devolved areas. The impact of all of these schemes was overwhelmingly positive, and many Welsh businesses and individuals are still in operation or employment as a result. That said, the Welsh Government identifies two key areas in which lessons can be learned to further improve its ability to respond to economic needs in a future pandemic scenario. First, there was a lack of clarity about the consequential funding to be made available to the Welsh Government. And second, There was a lack of information and consultation regarding the national support schemes, and more importantly, a limitation upon their availability in Wales, save for in accordance with English considerations. Turning to the first, the consequential funding to be received by the Welsh Government was particularly unclear at the outset of the pandemic. This inevitably impacted the ability of the Welsh Government to formulate its economic response during those early stages. Whilst Welsh ministers proceeded to make decisions at pace without this information when required, this lack of clarity necessitated that they did so at risk until such time as confirmation of funding was provided. The situation was somewhat alleviated upon the introduction of the Barnett Guarantee in July 2020, which provided advanced confirmation of consequential funding to be received as a result of COVID-19 response interventions in England. Further uplifts to the guarantee were then provided in October, November and December of 2020, although it did not continue into the 2021 to 22 financial year. Whilst the Barnett Guarantee did not entirely remove funding uncertainties, the Welsh Government welcomed this measure and is grateful for the certainties that it did provide. Indeed, the Welsh Government makes a recommendation for your Ladyship's consideration that the Barnett Guarantee should be introduced from the outset of any future pandemic or economic crisis and should remain in place until its conclusion. The Welsh Government further invites your Ladyship's consideration of other fiscal flexibilities during pandemic times, such as an increase to the amounts that may be carried forward at the end of a financial year, or the ability to switch from capital to revenue budgets. These and others were sought by the Welsh Government during the relevant period, but were refused, with one such refusal resulting in the recoupment of £155 million due to an underspend of funds which were provided to it very late in the 2020 to 21 financial year. Turning to the national support schemes, the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme and the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme were successful in Wales. They prevented employers from closing, preserved jobs and supported household spending, without which job loss and business closures in Wales would likely have been far higher. However, the absence of consultation regarding these schemes presented difficulties for the Welsh Government in the timely development of complementary support. Earlier and fuller engagement would have enabled the design and simultaneous announcement by the Welsh Government of its own package of assistance, which would have provided necessary reassurance to Welsh businesses during this period of considerable uncertainty. However, as stated earlier, the more pertinent issue for your Ladyship's consideration is the availability of the UK Government's national support schemes in the devolved nations when they were required, irrespective of a UK Government decision as to their necessity in England. My Lady, if public health legislation is to be utilised in responding to a pandemic situation, such that the devolved governments are required in law to independently exercise decision-making powers for their respective nations, it must follow that His Majesty's Treasury be made available to support those independent decisions in the same way that it is available to support decisions made by the UK Government for England. Unfortunately, it is the Welsh Government's view that at times such support was not available to Wales in the same way that it was in England. Your Ladyship has already received considerable evidence from the Welsh Government on this point in relation to the firebreak lockdown. Requests for assistance in supporting Wales's firebreak lockdown in October 2020 were denied, whilst the UK Government's later decision to impose such a measure in November 2020 was backed by the provision of support it required. This seemingly demonstrates a limitation in the availability of Treasury funds to support action taken by the Welsh Government where it does not align with the UK Government. A failure to make such support available in this manner indirectly ties the hands of the devolved governments in exercising their decision-making powers in a way that simply does not exist for the UK Government. This restriction upon decision-making was best illustrated during the emergence of the Omicron variant. As the Welsh Government's evidence demonstrates, Welsh ministers were in receipt of scientific evidence that promoted the imposition of greater non-pharmaceutical interventions to protect the public health position from the risks of the emerging new variant. However, the Welsh ministers were unable to act upon such advice to impose those measures, as they could not properly mitigate the economic risks of doing so, as a direct result of His Majesty's Treasury refusing to reinstate relevant support schemes in Wales. To this end, the Welsh Government invites your Ladyship to consider how the availability of this or similar support should operate during pandemic times to ensure that all 4 governments of the United Kingdom can exercise their respective decision-making powers on an equal footing. Turning briefly then, my lady, if I may, to the economic interventions put in place by the Welsh Government. These complementary measures, which included the Economic Resilience Fund, the COVID-19 Wales Business Loan Scheme and bus and rail transport schemes, sought to target those who fell through the gaps of the UK Government schemes. The Welsh Government will submit that it was largely successful in achieving its objective, providing more than £250,000 grants worth more than £2.6 billion, which was distributed to protect businesses and their employees throughout Wales. The successes of these interventions were seen not only in the very fact of the support provided, but also the multitude of sectors targeted, the utilisation of existing local authority systems, which permitted fast access to support at proportionate operational cost, and the robustness of the measures put in place to mitigate against the risk of fraud and error. There can be little doubt that such measures may have benefited from access to increased data sources, such as that from His Majesty's Revenue and Customs. However, in the absence of such, the Welsh Government was able to design and implement alternative processes which ensured that the support provided ended up exactly where it was intended to. My lady, in concluding this opening statement, the Welsh Government wishes to restate its enduring commitment to assisting your Ladyship and the inquiry, including in respect of your consideration of such matters as falls within the scope of this module. The Welsh Government acknowledges and welcomes the lessons to be learned in this module, as, notwithstanding the successes of the national and Welsh Government schemes, it is recognised that there will have been those who did not benefit or who do not consider that they benefited sufficiently. There will inevitably have been people who felt the economic repercussions of the public health measures far more deeply than others. The Welsh Government is committed to learning those lessons and building upon the successes of the response where they exist, in the hope of assisting even more of the Welsh population in the event of a future pandemic. Diolch, my lady.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Waters. Very grateful. Mr Chapman, I think you're right over there.
I am. Thank you, my lady. I make this short opening statement on behalf of the Cabinet Office, including number 10. The Cabinet Office wishes me to begin by restating its ongoing commitment to assisting the inquiry throughout this module, as in all other modules, in whatever ways it can. It has disclosed extensive material of relevance to the inquiry's work in Module 9, building on the vast quantity of evidence provided in previous modules. It has provided 2 detailed corporate statements for the purposes of this module, describing its role in relation to the economic response, and it supported several individual witnesses in providing evidence to this to the inquiry in this module. During the forthcoming hearings, the inquiry will hear oral evidence from 3 of the witnesses supported by the Cabinet Office. Taking them in the order in which they'll appear, first, Robert Harrison, former Director General for Analysis in the COVID-19 Task Force, will give evidence concerning the way data was used to support decision-making and his work and the work of his team to improve the process and systems for analysing data in the heart of government. Second, Dr. Ben Warner, former Special Advisor at Number 10, will give evidence relating to government analytical capabilities during the pandemic. And third, Mark Cheeseman, now Chief Executive of the Public Sector Fraud Authority, the PSFA, who was formerly the head of the Centre of Expertise in the Government Counter-Fraud Function. He will give evidence on the role it played in encouraging and supporting government departments to mitigate fraud and error during the course of the pandemic. And as the inquiry will hear, the Cabinet Office has proactively made improvements, including by the creation of new anti-fraud provisions in the Public Authorities Fraud, Error and Recovery Bill. As the inquiry knows, the Cabinet Office has a dual role at the centre of government. It both facilitates collective decision-making across government in relevant areas, and it supports and advises the Prime Minister and other Cabinet Office ministers. The Cabinet Office's corporate statements for this module set out the range of its functions during the pandemic, which included overall strategic coordination, informing decision-making with data and analysis, supporting departments to address fraud risks, and considering disproportionate impacts, including disproportionate economic impacts on disadvantaged and vulnerable members of our society. The COVID-19 task force disproportionately impacted groups subgroup, for example, was set up to examine, consider, and advise upon the impact of various interventions, including economic interventions, on vulnerable groups. The inquiry heard in Module 2 about the Cabinet Office's role in establishing structures such as ministerial implementation groups and the COVID-O and COVID-S framework to facilitate collective decision-making during the pandemic. While the economic interventions in response to the pandemic were of course discussed through that framework and in those structures, they were not the primary forums for decision-making in relation to economic interventions. During the pandemic, HM Treasury, as the UK Government's Economic and Finance Ministry, led on the policy work to develop the various economic interventions and worked with other departments on the delivery of those schemes. As is usual practice, they were typically discussed and agreed bilaterally between the Chancellor and the Prime Minister. A key part of the Cabinet Office's role in facilitating decision-making during the pandemic and helping ministers to balance the health, economic and other impacts of the pandemic was working to ensure that decision-making was supported by relevant data, analysis and expert advice. As explained in the corporate witness statement of Simon Ridley, these processes evolved over the course of the pandemic, including through the innovation of the COVID-19 dashboard and the separate economy dashboard, coupled with a substantially enhanced analytical capability within the COVID-19 task force in the Cabinet Office. Robert Harrison, former Director General for Analysis in the COVID-19 task force, will give evidence concerning the way data was used to support decision-making and work to improve the process and systems for analysing data. This included putting the analytical capacity developed within the Cabinet Office during the pandemic on a more permanent footing and the creation of the Joint Data and Analysis Centre. In addition, the National Situation Centre was established in 2021 to provide situational awareness for crisis response, bringing together data, analysis and critical expertise. The Cabinet Office also had an important role in the cross-government work to mitigate fraud against the public purse during the pandemic. The central team of the Government Counter-Fraud function, based in the Cabinet Office, advised departments in reducing fraud and error risks in relation to the economic schemes which they were responsible for administering. The PSFA now acts as the government centre of expertise in combating fraud against the public sector. The PSFA has identified a number of lessons from the management of fraud risk in the pandemic, which, as Mark Cheeseman explains in his evidence, have been integrated into the work of the PSFA and across government. The government has also appointed a COVID counter-fraud commissioner to provide assurance that everything possible has been done to recover public funds lost to fraud in the COVID schemes. Critically, the Public Authorities Fraud, Error and Recovery Bill will allow the PSFA to investigate suspected fraud against public authorities where there is limited investigatory provision. The bill will also increase the time limit for bringing civil claims in COVID-19 related fraud from 6 to 12 years, so giving the PSFA more time to investigate complex cases and apply its new powers. To conclude, the then government made what were, in its view, unprecedented economic interventions to support jobs and businesses and individuals through the pandemic and to seek to mitigate its wide-ranging impacts. HM Treasury led the policy work in relation to those economic interventions and worked with other departments on the delivery of the various schemes. The central team of the government's counter-fraud function worked to advise departments on how to mitigate fraud and error risks and how to conduct post-payment assurance. And more broadly, the Cabinet Office played a central role in the strategic coordination and analytical underpinning of the COVID-19 response. The Cabinet Office will continue to consider and reflect on the evidence as it emerges in this module and looks forward to the inquiry's report and recommendations in due course.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chapman. Very grateful. Mr. Block, I think you're... Oh, there you are. Right. I'm not sure you're...
Is it on now?
That's right. Thank you.
It took a moment to warm up. My lady, as you know, I represent 3 core participants in this module, 2 of whom wish to make opening statements. And the first is on behalf of the Department for Work and Pensions, and I am instructed by Elizabeth Ribello of the Government Legal Department for them. My lady, the department applied to become a core participant in this module because it recognised the key role it had played in the economic response to the COVID-19 pandemic through its various economic interventions, and it wished to assist the inquiry to fully understand these matters. My lady, although this is Module 9, this is the first time the department has addressed the inquiry, and it wishes to express its deepest sympathy to everyone affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, including those who lost loved ones, people who suffered serious illness, and everyone who has faced significant challenges and upheaval during this difficult and challenging time. The department also recognises and sympathises with members of the wider community who still continue to deal with the consequences of the pandemic, and it considers it's important for it to reflect on this period, both out of respect for people who are affected and to ensure that the government is better prepared for the future. The department has provided a written opening statement, a corporate witness statement, and 7 individual witness statements in this module. My lady, you're due to hear from 2 of the individual witnesses this week, the former Secretary of State, Baroness Coffey, and the former Minister for Welfare Delivery, Will Quince. To provide some context, the Department for Work and Pensions is the largest public service department in the United Kingdom. It has a mandate to assist the more vulnerable and economically disadvantaged members of our society. It's a role that the department takes extremely seriously, and it keeps it at the forefront of all its policy developments. It was no different during the pandemic. The interests and welfare of those adversely affected were at the heart of its economic interventions. The paramount objective was that services must be delivered to everyone affected and with speed, care and dedication. My lady, the 3 particular economic interventions identified by the inquiry and addressed within the corporate and individual witness statements for the department are, firstly, an increase of £20 to the Universal Credit Standard Allowance rate, which is generally referred to as the Universal Credit Uplift. Second, the statutory sick pay and the statutory sick pay rebate scheme. And thirdly, the employment schemes, Kickstart and the job entry targeted support. The interventions were largely determined by what was feasible within the benefits framework. As my lady will no doubt appreciate, the benefits framework is extremely complex and difficult to navigate. It's not possible in the time available today to explain the benefits framework and how each of the interventions were developed. We've attempted to do this in the written opening statement, the corporate witness statement, and the 7 individual witness statements. These provide a detailed account of the benefit system, the decisions made by and on behalf of the department during the pandemic and their underlying rationale. My lady, we respectfully refer you to those documents for a detailed account and understanding of the department's actions. the necessarily limited scope of the oral evidence must be considered alongside these detailed and largely unchallenged written accounts. The Department wishes to draw your attention to three key considerations that it took into account in designing, developing and implementing its interventions. And these were, first, each of the interventions was developed in close collaboration with His Majesty's Treasury, other government departments and devolved administrations. This close working relationship, in particular with His Majesty's Treasury, was maintained throughout the pandemic. In line with usual practice, the Department relied upon His Majesty's Treasury to approve the spending for the interventions. This was necessary as the Department does not have delegated authority for annually managed expenditure, and this is an important consideration we submit. Secondly, it carried out equality impact assessments for each of the interventions in line with its obligations under Section 149 of the Equality Act 2010 to have due regard to the public sector equality duty in the development of all of the Department's policies, programmes, projects and the services that affect its customers and staff. It's a duty that the Department has always taken very seriously, and the commitment is reflected in the corporate and individual witness statements. Thirdly, the policy design for each of the interventions and any easements were carefully considered before implementing them. The risk of fraud and error was recognised, and one that the Department did not ever underestimate. But, my lady, you'll hear of the fraud concern from the former Minister for Welfare Delivery, Will Quince. The Department was faced with two equally strong but competing concerns. On the one hand, it had to provide financial support to the millions of new and existing claimants in line with public health guidance, and on the other, it had to safeguard against fraud. These two competing considerations had to be carefully balanced. The Department fully recognised its fiduciary duties and the need to manage public funds. However, the prevailing circumstances left it with little choice but to accept the risk at the time with a view to removing the easements at the earliest opportunity, which it in fact did. This is addressed in detail within those statements. It is widely acknowledged that the scale of the challenge to design, implement and action benefits changes at all stages of the pandemic was unprecedented. The Department believes that it rose to meet those challenges, and this was against a background of moving to working from home, geographically relocating staff and dealing with staff absences due to contracting COVID. The Department succeeded in processing and paying claims promptly. The Department's efforts were guided by comprehensive business continuity plans, which had been refined over 20 years and tested across Whitehall and through internal department exercises. It took every step to maximise the processing capacity of its job centres and service centres. And, my lady, it quickly secured 30,000 additional laptops, and by July 2020, all 30,000 staff were able to work virtually. Given it's the largest public department in the country, this was a tremendous achievement and one that was the subject of positive comment and feedback at the time. My lady, right from the start of the pandemic, events moved quickly, and this required the department to respond at pace in designing and delivering new initiatives and schemes. At the time, the department had to ensure that delivery of its key services remained unaffected despite these pressures. So it's not just the new, it's the old as well. And this it managed to do successfully. Post-pandemic, the department proactively conducted a range of internal and external reviews and lessons learned exercises to examine its processes and procedures. So we hope that it is even better prepared to handle future crises. But notwithstanding this, my lady, the department remains fully committed to this inquiry and will welcome any recommendations that you make to strengthen and enhance its response to any future emergency. And, my lady, unless I can assist you further, those are the submissions on behalf of the department.
Thank you, Mr. Block.
My Lady, if I may move now to make opening submissions on behalf of His Majesty's Treasury. My Lady, I think as you will recall, I act with Mr. Gray for this core participant, and we're instructed by Robin Smith of the Government Legal Department. My Lady, you have today already heard various and wide-ranging submissions regarding this module, which concerns the government's response, economic response to the pandemic. We're grateful to Mr. Wright, King's Counsel, no doubt ably supported by the whole inquiry team, for helping set out the focused approach the inquiry will take to this module. And we're also grateful to those core participants who've submitted written opening statements and addressed you today, and we do take into account what they say for their setting out the various issues of concern to them in relation to this module. My Lady, the Treasury, of course, played a central role in the economic interventions made in response to the COVID pandemic. Its work extended across the United Kingdom, including funding for and liaison with the devolved administrations, local government and other relevant public services and voluntary and community sectors. I wish to assure both the inquiry and those core participants who've already addressed you today that the Treasury has been and remains committed to engaging fully with this inquiry. The issues raised today, and as the hearings progress over the next 4 weeks, will all receive careful consideration, and the Treasury will endeavour to respond to them all, including by reference to lessons already learned and additional work already undertaken by the conclusion of this module. As my Lady knows, the written evidence before the inquiry in this module is extensive. I'm not the first to refer to that. That includes the detailed corporate evidence supplied by the Treasury, as well as the evidence from 9 individual Treasury officials and 2 former Chief Secretaries to the Treasury and the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Mr. Sunak. Our written opening statement provides an overview of that evidence, and we won't repeat that here. Suffice to say that the Treasury urges anyone who wishes fully to understand the actions of the Treasury, as well as the Chancellor and other ministers, in the course of the government's economic response to the pandemic, to have regard to that full range of written evidence submitted to the inquiry. Our written opening statement was intended to set the scene for Module 9 from the Treasury's perspective. It includes an overview of 1, the roles and responsibility of His Majesty's Treasury and the Chancellor of the Exchequer and other Treasury ministers and officials, so as to assist the inquiry and the public to put the evidence to be heard in Module 9 in its appropriate context. 2, the scale of the economic shock caused by the pandemic to which His Majesty's Treasury was required to respond, again to provide important context. And 3, the Treasury's approach to the economic response to the pandemic. In this brief oral opening statement, I wish to emphasise some of the key points relating to that response, which, from the Treasury's perspective, are of particular relevance to the evidence which the inquiry and the public are going to hear in the next 4 weeks. My Lady, I have 8 key points. First, the primary cross-government objective during the pandemic was to contain the virus and save lives. That objective was not inconsistent with the Treasury's economic and fiscal responsibilities during the pandemic. The Treasury's long-term objectives of economic growth and stability depended on control of the virus. Controlling the virus was therefore essential for protecting both public health and the economy. Economic interventions were therefore designed to be consistent with and supportive of the public health measures. As the public health measures developed, the economic interventions evolved to complement them accordingly. Second, the economic impact of the pandemic was immediate, on an unprecedented scale and unique. From the beginning, GDP fell sharply, and there was a real risk of businesses failing, mass unemployment, and significant long-term economic damage to the country.
This situation was compounded by the fact that there was an extraordinarily high degree of uncertainty in all economic analysis during the pandemic, whether by the Treasury or elsewhere. There was no comparable historical precedent to draw on to assess the economic impact of NPIs, with the impacts themselves changing over time and dependent on the path of the virus, which itself was changing and being learnt about over time. The nature of the COVID economic shock was also unique, as it involved the unprecedented intentional suppression of economic activity by the government through the use of lockdowns and other social restrictions in the interests of the United Kingdom's long-term public health and economic recovery. Third, within that context, the Treasury's institutional objectives, namely ensuring economic growth, fiscal sustainability and financial stability, nevertheless remained consistent throughout the pandemic and shaped the design of the economic interventions. I have 5 bullet points. 1, to prevent unemployment and support living standards. 2, to prevent viable businesses from failing. 3, to protect the most vulnerable and avoid unfair impacts. 4, to ensure economic activity was consistent with public health restrictions and enable rapid recovery as restrictions eased. And 5, to maintain value for money and fiscal discipline and safeguard against fraud. My lady, a whole suite of economic support schemes was developed and implemented across the United Kingdom, focused on those economic objectives to provide direct support to businesses, households and individuals. However, it was equally important to ensure that support measures did not inadvertently slow down recovery once restrictions eased. Ensuring people were not economically inactive for longer than necessary also mitigated the risk of longer-term economic damage. Striking the right balance, providing timely support when economic activity was not possible, whilst also allowing businesses and individuals to transition out of reliance on government interventions as conditions improved, was a core consideration in designing and implementing the economic interventions. Fourth, the economic response to the COVID pandemic was unprecedented in speed, scale, borrowing and spending, and breadth. The United Kingdom's economic support package was among the largest and most comprehensive globally. It directly prevented the loss of millions of jobs and the closure of thousands of businesses. In response to the COVID pandemic generally, the government borrowed more than an additional £300 billion across 2020 and 2021 and 2021-22, with record peacetime borrowing recorded in the first of those years. Regarding the economic interventions, CJRS or furlough alone prevented 4 million direct job losses and saved many businesses from closure. The United Kingdom government's economic response to the pandemic prevented a public health crisis from also becoming an economic crisis. Fifth, the unprecedented nature of the crisis, the various economic challenges presented by the pandemic, and the scale of the required response nevertheless required flexibility and trade-offs. The Treasury was not blind to fraud and error risks, but those risks had to be balanced against the countervailing risks of mass unemployment and significant economic damage that would have been caused by inaction or a delayed response. That balancing exercise required very difficult judgment calls to be made and at pace. Sixth, as a result of the heightened uncertainties during the pandemic, the Treasury relied on a wide range of analytical tools and techniques to try to understand what was happening in the economy and inform policy development. These tools, which included established and new economic models, were developed and refined throughout the pandemic. Alongside traditional modelling approaches, new capabilities were rapidly built. The Treasury also engaged with external experts and institutions such as the OBR, the IMF and the OECD, utilising their analysis to inform policy. As an example of where the written evidence will be essential to the inquiry in this module, the Module 9 witness statement of Vanessa McDougall, at the time the Director of the Economics Group in the Treasury between January and October 2020, provides particular detail regarding the Treasury's approach to data analysis and modelling. The Treasury also engaged with the scientific community to ensure that economic decisions were informed by the latest health intelligence, including the emerging evidence in relation to long COVID. Seventh, economic data, of course, played an important role in economic analysis during the pandemic. The Treasury had a comprehensive data monitoring, briefing and analysis function in place before the pandemic. During the pandemic, the Treasury's analysis brought together different types of economic intervention to understand the economic impacts of the virus, restrictions and economic support policies. This included analysis of data and evidence of both what was happening in the United Kingdom and in other countries. Traditional economic data was supplemented with additional data sources that provided a more rapid and real-time picture of economic activity, and which had not previously been used to consider economic impacts, such as, for example, transport data from the Department for Transport, education data from the Department for Education, to understand levels of mobility across the United Kingdom and school attendances and absences. The Treasurer also obtained data from travel and hospitality applications such as Google Maps, City Mapper and OpenTable, as well as anonymised credit card usage data. Data analysis and modelling were highly interdependent throughout the pandemic. Modelling was used to understand and interpret the data and to help identify which data would be most useful. Data provided inputs and calibration to the modelling. The quality of the modelling was therefore dependent on the data, but also in particular on the assumptions applied. And the uncertainties around those data and assumptions is the principal reason why the utility of economic modelling in the pandemic became an issue. With respect, the inquiry should be wary of criticism of the Treasury's use of data and modelling for those who had no real involvement in economic modelling and analysis during the pandemic. Data analysis is, though, an example of where the Treasury has already started to build on its experience during the pandemic to improve its ways of working. The Treasury has continued to develop its analytical capabilities. It has deepened its engagement with the Office for National Statistics and the newly established Joint Data and Analysis Centre in the Cabinet Office, and continues to build its modelling capabilities supported by academic engagement. The Treasury has also expanded its data science capabilities, establishing a data science team in 2022. It has increased its analysis of economic risks, including establishing a new horizon scanning workstream within the Economic Risk Group to monitor and assess future risks to the economy more systematically. And my lady, eighth and finally, the Treasury worked closely with other government departments, local government and external institutions to deliver the economic interventions. The Treasury developed and implemented CJRS and SICE in lockstep with HMRC and DWP, and collaborated with BASE and the British Business Bank to deliver support to businesses. The Treasury also sought to engage extensively with the devolved administrations to ensure that their perspectives were factored into decision-making as far as possible, and provided them with an unprecedented funding guarantee. And my lady, just 1 minute on lessons learned. The Treasury continued to seek to improve its ways of working to ensure economic resilience in the event of any future health or major crisis. There have already been extensive evaluations of the COVID economic support and recovery schemes, and lessons have been learned in a number of areas as set out in the corporate witness evidence. And, my lady, the Treasury welcomes the opportunity to address you today, and it will build on that work through this module of the inquiry. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your help, Mr Block, and for bringing proceedings today to a close. Subject to one matter, Mr Wright.
Yes, my lady. It's just, could we have permission, please, to publish the written submissions that have been received by core participants?
Certainly.
Thank you.
Very well. I shall return tomorrow, Tuesday the 25th at 10 o'clock. All rise.